afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to our second Palaver session. My name is Wheeler Winstead, and I am the Assistant Director for the Center for African Studies. And I first want to thank all of our partners for participating and making this series, I think, the great series that it has been and will be. First, I want to thank the Ralph Bunche Affairs, International Affairs Center, and we have our director, Tania Hope Novice is here. Thank you very much, Tania, for making the Ralph Bunche Center available and for being a partner with us. And in addition to the Ralph Bunche International Affairs Center, we have participating as a partner also the School of Social Work, represented by Dr. Sandra Crewe and also Michael Mbanaso, who will be speaking. And in addition to the School of Social Work, we have one of our partners, the Department of Political Science, and that's represented by Dr. Lorenzo Morris. So we want to thank all of our partners for being a part of this and making it the successful series that it has been. First, the Palaver series is a part of the Center for African Studies. I think some of you, actually I think most of you in this room, might be familiar with the Center for African Studies is, but for those of you who may not be familiar with the Center was created to facilitate the acquisition of advanced level knowledge of continental Africa and African languages. And it was developed to build the capacity of both students and instructors at Howard University and DC metropolitan area. The Center includes programs like our Summer Institute, the FLAS Fellowship, where we give out fellowships to students to study African languages, the Palaver series, which is what we're doing today, our visiting professor program, which we have a visiting professor with us, Dr. James King from Salisbury University is here. And it's funded by the Department of from the U.S. Department of Education and their International and Foreign Language Education Program, which is a part of Title VI. We do have several of our important staff here with the center. We have Brenda Randolph, back there, and she is our outreach coordinator and doing an excellent job. I hope some of you who are a part of middle schools and a part of high schools take advantage of some of the things that we're offering for both teachers in these schools. Excellent program. We also have Dr. John, who is the principal investigator for the center and also the director for the Center for African Studies. In addition, I want to acknowledge Dr. Kudor Snell. Thank you for coming, and he is the Assistant Provost of International Affairs. We really appreciate you coming and participating. We actually appreciate everyone here.
I'm also a social work person for Dean Crewe.
Okay, all right.
That's my dean.
So anyway, that's a little bit about the center. The Palaver series, which is a part of the center, was designed specifically to bring together prominent scholars and public servants in collaboration with various institutions and departments. And the purpose of doing that is to shed light on what we would consider pressing issues facing Africa today. And this is an example, the series today is an example of one of the issues that we believe are pressing. Just a little housekeeping. Because we are recording this session, and because your microphones really do not work, so you don't have to worry about pressing them, please speak up loudly and clearly, and we will probably repeat your question up here so that it can be heard when on the recording. Second, we also hope that all of you signed in so that we can make sure that we have your names on our list so you can be invited again. And by the way, if you have been getting 2 or 3 emails of the same notice, let us know that. We'll try to correct that. If not, just continue to spread the word. So we apologize if you are getting 2 or 3 emails. The session today also has information about all of our presenters. If you did not get that program, we just did a little program for you to have a little bit more detailed information about our speakers and a little bit about their background. As I said, this is the second of the Palaver series, and this particular series is focusing on rethinking migration, citizenship, and human rights in a volatile era. We have two presenters, Dr. Sandra Crewe, Dean of the School of Social Work, Dr. Michael Mbanaso, he is the Adjunct Associate Professor of the School of Social Work, both here at Howard. And as moderator discussant, we have Dr. Lorenzo Morris, Professor of Political Science at Howard. And we're going to actually turn this now over into Dr. Morris's hands. Again, the way we like to proceed is that they will make their presentations, and then we will have approximately 20 minutes of Q&A. So if you could hold you want them to hold their comments into the Q&A section. I guess we can do that, but if you are, while you're making your presentation, if you decide to change that, we can do that. But ideally, the idea is that you would hold your questions and comments till we get to Q&A section, and then we can have a discussion. I think that's all for right now, so thank you all for coming, and let's welcome Dr. Lorenzo Morris.
Thank you. I think this is an important and very timely topic for African studies and for social work and for all of the disciplines represented here. And I don't want to get too much in the way of the enlightened discussion which our presenters will share, but they asked me with very limited explication to be a discussant and a moderator, and I took the discussant first. And in a program that is entitled Palaver, I thought that given the origins of the word, I was free to talk incessantly. So I made some incessant talking points, and I know that is not my function now that I've been promoted to moderator. So I'm going to ask people that I know. I guess Dr. Sham would be the most aggressive to signal me to shut up and sit down if I just go on beyond a reasonable amount of time. Okay, but I just wanted to make a couple of points around this general area. And one of them, I guess they stem from a favorite saying in the civil rights movement, at least of Dr. King's, that we are bound as a nation and as a world in a network of mutuality. I think surges in immigration are reflexes and responses to surges in adverse politics and policies of the nations which generate them. There's a very interesting study on migration in France, which is the European country that I know most about in terms of African migration, that argues basically that migration stimulates in its waves in individual European countries from a delayed invitation. An invitation that is based on their economic needs. As we look to the places where these African and Syrian and Lebanese and Jordanian and Afghanistani and Iraqians are going, they have historically been places whose birth rates are declining, or in the case of Germany, in a prosperous economy with a declining birth rate population, and countries that had previously encouraged others. Germany had a strong Turkish migration, and now with the new wave of immigrants, they appear to be more skilled than some. There's an article in the Post, there was an article in the Post day before yesterday that began with the plight of a Somali migrant in Germany. And he's been in hiding, as many had for years. And the article shows some sympathy towards him and talks about the 80,000 a year in the past year coming from Syria and elsewhere, but misses the point that the African migrants there had come not just for economic reasons, but had come over a long series of European incentives, sometimes negative, sometimes positive. It's easy to see in the disrupted countries where there is a war and where there is a torn up economy that there's a link. But we often forget the long-term links. In 1973, more than 130,000 sub-Saharan Africans were given automatic citizenship if they were in France as a result of the colonial period. The economic intervention in other countries would be a comparable indicator. And the U.S. likes to think of itself, in contrast to Europe, as a melting pot, but in the 20th century and in the current century, but particularly in the 20th century, the waves of immigration from Africa and from the Maghreb were substantial, and in part because they responded to the varying economic interests of the Europeans. And so that in France today, and again as an example, about a fourth of the population, meaning second generation or first, should be considered immigrant, are considered immigrant. What that means is that there are links to the prior countries. Most people tend to see immigration as people, at least the American television version, which of course is, just one step away from Donald Trump's version. Most people tend to see immigrants as people sitting around their house, maybe with a little poverty or something, and say, oh, I'm going to go to Europe and have a good life. Most often migrants who travel internationally have been forced into internal migration. When I looked at West African migration in France years ago, that was the case, that they frequently had moved to the cities and they were inhospitable. We see with the Syrians and others who are outside of Africa that the wars are there, but the internal wars in Africa also compel a relation. The question may be, to what extent are those two things tied, and to what extent is the resistance there? These countries, whatever these might be, whether they're in Europe, whether it is Great Britain, or elsewhere, have the capacity certainly to absorb, and the need at some levels to absorb continued integration, but they have an increased resistance. That becomes from a rather race-sensitive isolation of their policies and politics. And some of it begins with globalization and the xenophobia that is provoked by the denial of national obligations, both to internal people and to external, and the interdependence of labor. But feeling this sense of my taking advantage of the political science palaver predilection, I'm going to probably try to stop myself, which is often a difficult thing. Is there anything? I don't think I need to go on this, though I may make some comments afterwards to point out that the interdependence of Europe today and Africa, not just West Africa where we see it more often, but elsewhere, is strong enough so that the failures of the economies which make the move are significant. Now, just one example before I go, because it doesn't seem to be particularly relevant. Once I was invited to Ghana to comment on genetically modified products. There were a group of African ministers from all over Africa, ministers of agriculture there. And they were resisting pressure to deal in genetically modified products at this meeting. And, I actually got time. What's that 10 mean? I have 10 left?
10 left.
Oh, I'm only the moderator and I get 10?
You're doing fine.
Oh, okay, so back to the story. So Dr. Crewe has to go, so I'll finish my comments later.
I'm fine.
Okay. All right. Well, in this moment, first of all, I was invited by the Dean of Agriculture at Tuskegee, and since he was an old friend, I assumed it was just a chance to give me a free trip to Ghana. But while I was there, I thought maybe I could do something. So I took a little survey and did a little investigating and discovered that part of the dilemma was, of course, the restrictions on genetically modified products in the European agricultural system, but also part of it was the big American corporate, and I won't name the large corporations that I found out that were financing people at that conference to take an opposite position. And it was an overwhelming American corporate presence, creating an agricultural dilemma for these countries attempting to market to the European Union countries. We must remember that even the European Union was historically an economic entity that grows out of the post-colonial period, one that helps them to deal with the failures of colonialism to sustain their raw materials dependent countries and economies. So that that mutual network can be seen in a larger political perspective as well. And it comes right up to the differences between Europe, between Germany and other countries. Those that have an economy which can benefit from the semi-skilled and skilled labor that can come are more receptive. Those that are not as receptive. But the problem is that within each of those countries, the increased distance in wealth in the inhabitants, as the famous Piketty book points out in Capital in the 21st Century, makes it for a political situation in which xenophobic reactions are not only grown but are encouraged because they stabilize at some level. At some levels, the supremacy of the mainstream parties in dealing with what they consider marginalized groups. So these marginalized groups have a presence where? They have been successful in the European Union. And they get legitimacy in their local government from that. So you're creating this. We are letting be created, this super sphere of anti-immigrant population based on a naive xenophobic reaction, which makes no grounds of significant impact at the local level, or decreasing grounds, but make huge grounds in this globalized Europeanized union, and that union itself is a response historically to economic inequality, which it often seeks to promote and to prosper. But the European Union, linked as it is to the United Nations, to the CERD, for example, there's a National Commission on Human Rights in France, the CERD, the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, of international focus, demands respect for the basic rights of migrants and of others, and of refugees particularly. But the concept of refugees is often limited to by those who submit immediate violence. But the violence of Africans who migrate is long-term, it is historical, and it is translated into economic parameters. But those economic parameters have a very human, or should I say inhuman, historical basis. But someone who can look at that with greater perspective is someone with a social work background. And I don't just mean our esteemed associate provost, I mean our dean of social work. On the way over here, I was telling her about an experience which perhaps leads me to reiterate it, which was that in Mali, which many of you know has had a strained economic history, I encountered a group of physicians, and the healthcare in Mali was terrible. This was in the 90s, still is. And I said, well, you must really want, one of the things Howard might be able to do is build in other places to build a service with physicians. And they said, no, in order to improve healthcare, we need more social workers. We need people how to understand, to integrate the society. And there were no social services, there was no social civic culture, no things that were there to reinforce that. And I looked around, and I didn't finish the story. And I looked around at the universities in Mali and elsewhere, and I noticed one thing, that there had been so many colonial presences, including the Russian, which had left, that the very bases, the educational institutions which would promote the civic culture, were decimated. And in the end, no one would notice that the deprivation there were linked to that cultural intervention and the cultural conflicts of the French and the Russians and the Europeans presence who abandoned it and destroyed some of the institutional bases that were there. And that's one of the reasons we're here today, is to try to rectify that. And one of the reasons we call on our distinguished social work colleague, Dr. Crewe. Dr. Crewe is not only Dean of Social Work, she has a distinguished background. She holds a certificate, she is a certified social worker in the National Association of Social Workers. She holds a certificate from Harvard Institute of Leadership and Management, and she has been an important presence at the Howard University in social work for a number of years, and is leading the college now that Dr. Snell has moved to in another direction. Dean Crewe, it's a pleasure to introduce.
Dr. Winston, I appreciate being here. Dr. Morris, thank you so much for your comments. It's always interesting to follow Dr. Morris. We never know quite where we're going with this conversation, meaning that he has such depth, and I say that with a very genuine spirit here. Dr. Mbanaso, a longtime member of our faculty, and has made marvelous contributions to what we do in social work. One of the things that I will note, and I'm sure will come up later, is that we have a course on international social work, and that's largely through the work of Dr. Mbanaso. I am probably one of the least qualified colleagues at social work to talk about this topic. But what I'm most qualified to talk about is social work. And so I'm going to make the nexus here, and hopefully you will be able to sort of pull it all together to see how it fits. But before I do, I'd like to introduce Ms. Helen Shanway. Ms. Shanway is the CEO of Pinocchio Creche, child care center in Cape Town, South Africa. And so she was one of and we've taken our students there every year to experience social work outside of the domain of the United States. And preparing for this presentation, I really just arrived late last night from out-of-town travel. And one of the things that struck me as I was out of town yesterday, I attended a church service. And the church service, it was a battle of choirs, if you will. And so as they were having their fellowship, there was a particular choir that stood up and said, "I've got the right. And almost every member of that choir stood up and proclaimed, "I've got the right." And I started reflecting upon that in view of today's presentation, is what gave them the right? What gave them the right to be there and to do what they were doing? So two individuals came to mind as I began to think about this. One is Stephen Biko, and one of his quotes is, "The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed." And another favorite person of mine is Harriet Tubman. And she said, "I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more if only they knew they were enslaved." That to me has a lot to do with this particular topic and tying it back to "I've got the right." Meaning that there is something inherent in the individual spirit that makes the difference as to how they respond to migration. And that is what social work is best known for. The pressing issues that are facing Africa, and as it relates to interdependence, have a lot to do with not just movement of one place to the other, but how well that movement takes place. Sometimes we assume that the movement is the answer, but it's person and environment when we talk social work. Meaning that if the person does not have the resources that are needed, then the migration may not be a successful experience. If the person is dealing with all of the isms that come with them, the oppressions, then they are not going to have a good experience. So as we begin to sort of talk about migration, we really have to really get it down to the level of the individualized experience as well as the collective experience. So sometimes we sort of move forward with the collective experience and really don't spend enough time thinking about these are individuals who have changed their lives, uprooted in some ways, and now the adjustments have to be made to a hostile community sometimes. And I think the challenges that we have today, Dr. Morris, sometimes the community does not have open arms when we're looking at the issues of migration. And the reason they don't have open arms is because they've been fed misinformation. And so when the misinformation really comes together with some of the things that we talk about in social work, we create a hostile environment for the person. So I think we have a lot of work to do in this country. And I wanted to just mention a few things about social work and what we do. One of the articles I had the pleasure of co-authoring with Dr. Mbanaso had to do with older persons. You know, we kind of think about older persons migrating, but what happens when you age in a country that is not your country? And how do you carry that with you and become really an important part of a new community, but yet what we often hear is that I want to go back home. So how do you become a part of a new community but still address the needs of the older population who still wants to be a part of the community that they left? So it's not unusual for us to hear is that I want to return home and to die in my own country. It sounds morbid, but people think of that as a really important part of life, is where you return home to. So as we think about migration, I sort of wanted to kind of throw that into the discussion. The history of human rights is that of the struggle against exploitation of one person against another. It is based upon the recognition of basic rights and founded on the concept of the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. As those choir members stood up yesterday, they were declaring their inherent right for dignity. And I thought it was interesting because it was in rural America that they were so connected to their African roots. Here we are years apart from that time frame, but their spirit was really kind of calling them back, called in response to the point of their ancestry. The recognition of human rights was consolidated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the General Assembly of the United Nations. Its preamble asserted recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and unalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. So when I thought about this more, what we often focus on are violations of human rights. We don't talk about it a whole lot when we get it right. So our focus often goes to what happens when human rights are violated. But we also need to be mindful of what happens when they're not. That means that the person has a spirit, that they can really become comfortable and grow into their full being. But when we think about the violation of human rights, we really begin to think about the phenomenon of the disappeared, the torture of political prisoners, summary killings, arbitrary arrests, the increasing use of the death penalty, the extortion of confessions by physical and mental abuse, the manipulation of the intellectual, emotional, and moral pressures that are imposed on the individuals. These are the kind of things that we think about. Many factors contribute to the violation of human rights. The collapse of totalitarian regimes in Eastern Europe did not bring an end to the human rights abuses, and we know that. You can't legislate them away. Nobody has better experience with that than we have here in the United States. The laws are not sufficient to get rid of human rights violation. So it really does begin with us focusing on some of the principles that really matter when we approach one human being as another human being. Human rights condenses into two words: the struggle for dignity and fundamental freedoms, which allow for the full development of the human potential. We have to support the full development of the human potential. Civil and political rights have to be accompanied by economic, social, and cultural rights. So as we think about the nexus with migration, it's not enough for movement. We have to make sure when people move from one location to the other that they are able to achieve their human and civil rights at the same time. Achieving one without the other does not achieve the goals that we set forth here. Social workers are long known for their interest in the human development through the adherence of some basic principles. One of the ones that I really think I hold near and dear is that every human being has a unique value. They are valued, which justifies their moral consideration for that person. In social work, we talk about colleagues out there who are social work, starting where the client is. So if we start where the client is, we recognize that they have unique strengths, that they will be able to address some of the human inequities that are there, but we must begin to have them appreciate that they can overcome some of these struggles. But we also know that they cannot do it individually often, that we need systems that are responsive and respectful to what they are achieving. We also know that each individual has the right to self-fulfillment to the extent that it does not encroach upon the same right of others. That's the tough part. So as we sort of embrace individuals in terms of migration, the concern we often face is that by another individual coming in, are they taking rights of those individuals who are still here? That's that conflict, and we have to deal with it as social workers all the time. That the fact that we embrace a new group does not mean that we have to rid ourselves of some of our particular rights. This is a struggle that almost every social worker addresses today, as we are looking at societies that are made up of individuals from all walks of life. Social workers have a commitment to the principles of social justice. And when we say that we have a commitment to it, it goes beyond simply mouthing the words. It really does require that we speak to the individuals and understand that gender, age, race, color, language, religions, or political beliefs, sexual orientation, status of social class, all matter. All of them matter. One is not hierarchical to the other. All of them matter because we're addressing the needs of the whole person. So when we address the needs of the whole person, then we must not only pay attention to the inextricable link between well-being in the society or their culture, but how they are able to communicate with each other with respect. And sometimes that's our greatest challenge, to find the place where we can respect each other. Social workers generally expect clients to take responsibility for determining courses. Now, I'm one colleague that I'm a bit weary of the whole responsibility argument. We often hear that it's the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. It's the responsibility of the client to get on with the program. It's the responsibility of the new citizens to adapt to the ways that we have. We cannot negate that we also have responsibility as well. And one of the things we know in this country in particular, that we have taken advantage of groups that have come in, but yet focus more on the advantages we believe that they have received. And so we have a history of exploitation of individuals. So the question becomes, how do we move beyond the exploitation that we see to working communally so that we can really talk about the principles, not more in a way of rhetoric, but talk about them in a more meaningful way. Social workers deal with common human needs. It's often said that social workers are the conscience of the other professions. So when other professions are really talking about capitalism and how a group has been exploited, we're really asking the question, what role did you play in that? Not only who was victimized by it, but what role did you play in that? And how do you move from that point of being a victim to a person who really can take ownership? So that's why I read in the beginning the quotes from Harriet Tubman and Stephen Biko. Because if we allow the spirits of individuals to be killed, to be destroyed, then they become willing partners to the oppression and the exploitation that happens with them. As a result of the role that social workers play in society, we really do insist that we not only pay attention to what has happened in the current, in the here and now, but what's the historical background that goes with that. It's really important because we sometimes forget that there's history behind how the reason people feel the way they feel. They have some information that we do not have. So as we begin to think about social work, we really want to begin to think about life, the value of life. It is essential to human rights work. If we value life, then we can take the next step of bridging the gaps and rethinking migration and some of the atrocities that begin to happen. We also value freedom and liberty. We know that although we start with the client is, that every client is not in the same place. And we have to respect that. All human beings are born free. Everyone is born free. It's what happens to them after they're born that really determines their well-being. So the fundamental freedoms to include the right to liberty, to freedom from slavery, to freedom from arbitrary arrest, torture, cruel, inhumane and degrading treatment, and the freedom of thought and speech. That's freedom and liberty. Equality and non-discrimination. We all have the fundamental right for this equality. Justice. Every person has a right to protection against arbitrary arrest or interference from privacy. Solidarity. We have the right to be able to assemble with groups. Those are parts of the liberties that are important. Social responsibility. We have that. We need to think about social responsibility. Peace and nonviolence and the environment all fall under the rubrics of social work and thinking about human rights. So as I begin to sort of wrap this up, human rights are generally referred to in terms of generations of human rights. The first generation rights are civil and political rights, like the right to vote, freedom of speech, freedom from discrimination, and fair trial. Second generation rights are economic, social, and cultural rights, like the right to health, housing, social security, and education. Third generation rights are collective rights, such as the right to development and self-determination. Major contributions of the social work professionals to the field of human rights fall within each of these stated categories. We have a number of exemplars in the field of social work who have really espoused the importance of human rights. I'm going to focus on one in particular, and perhaps two, mindful of the time, but I don't know how many of you know that the School of Social Work is named after Dr. Annabelle Burns Lindsay, the founding dean of the School of Social Work. And she was the first woman who was an academic dean at Howard University and in the surrounding areas. And she also had an international focus, even at that time. So we have always embraced the notion of international. But when Dr. Lindsay was our dean, the one thing that she confronted was civil rights injustices. And in confronting civil rights injustices, she really basically stated that we cannot begin to think about providing social work unless we pay attention to culture. And that so much relates to migration. Because unless we pay attention to the culture of the person who's coming in, then we will not be able to meet their needs. So when she started talking about cultural consciousness, socio-cultural perspectives, it really is very much, it is inextricably linked to migration. Because if we look at one's culture, we're able to make decisions that are beneficial to the person. Another person that I will just mention very quickly that most of you probably know about is E. Franklin Frazier, who was one of the, also known as the founder of the School of Social Work. He served with the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, focusing on the struggle of Africa and African descent to achieve equality. His focus on race and culture were equally important to our contributions in the area of social work. So in conclusion, social work is a profession whose purpose is to bring about positive social change at the individual, group, community, and global levels. As social workers, we are involved in planning, implementing, evaluating, and modifying preventative social policies and services to groups and communities. As we begin to think about the topic that's before us, migration, and some of the human rights injustices that we see, we must remember that to eradicate injustices, there have to be champions. There must be champions out there who are willing to speak to the needs of the individuals and not solely focus on what the needs of society are without specific focus on how that individual fits within the whole community. So this is a really wonderful topic for us to explore more. But what I would say to you in sort of thinking about this, when we look at the atrocities, they're very much based on power and privilege. And often people who are experiencing migration have neither. So if we're going to make it a better world for everyone, we have to think of ways to incorporate different ideals and beliefs so that we are really focused on the common good for all. Because I am better when you are better. And that's the way we begin to sort of think about that. We hear about Ubuntu, but when we think migration as a way of strengthening society rather than diminishing another person's capacity, then we have the ability to think collectively and that we can move to a better world. Thank you.
Crewe, do you have 5 more minutes?
Yes.
Okay, she has to leave, and we were going to do questions and answers after everyone speaks, but because she has to leave, I'm suggesting that maybe we take 5 minutes, you moderate 5 minutes of just Q&A for Dean Crewe. And Dean Crewe, if you could come back to the microphone here. This one, by the way, this one doesn't work.
Is that okay?
You can come back. And those of you who have a question or comment, maybe you can have them stand, but if you can go ahead and moderate. 5 minutes.
Moderators moderating. Dean Crewe raised a lot of important issues, not just the breadth of social work, but the breadth of human rights. And so if any of you would like to ask a question. All right, Dr. Gooden.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I really appreciate it. One of the things that I've been thinking about is why I'm here. Given the recent situation, going, I mean, given what happened last week and given what's going on right now with the migrants, in Europe, when you look at it from a human rights perspective, right, or a humanitarian perspective, how do you deal with that? Right? In other words, if you look at it in a way politically, where you can, it's very different. But as you said, right, when you have this kind of human expectation, right, and the idea of being humanitarian, I mean, how do you deal with it? How do you deal with a 3-year-old child washing up on a beach, or someone saying, well, we are only alive, or we are alive only because we're not dead? Right, so how does one deal with that?
It's not an easy answer to that, but you start recognizing that there were circumstances that you don't know about. So part of the reason I think we respond to things the way we do is that we think we have all of the information. But as social workers, we assume that we don't have all of the information. So even though what happened was atrocious, we really go back to thinking what contributed to this. Not just looking at the as-is state, but something contributed to what was happening. So when you're able to do that, then you're able to go beyond what you see, to think about what was there that you did not see. And you'll see that often, it's sort of like a sound bite on the news. You will get the sound bite, but you don't know what was really behind that. So we really focus on trying to get a deeper understanding of what might have contributed to some of the things that we see. If we simply stop with what we see in front of us, then we've missed an opportunity to correct the action. And that's why this country so often, and other countries so often, use this penalty as a solution to problems, rather than restoration and restructuring the person, because we're trying to fix what we see in front of us, and we're not taking the opportunity to understand what are some of the underlying reasons that this might have happened. Not justifying the end outcome, but recognizing it's usually much deeper than that. And most social workers will tell you, the more they talk with individuals, they see other things that were really there, and if someone had paid attention to that, then we wouldn't have to be paying attention to this. And so you almost have to put blinders on in some ways. And I'll get to you, one of the assignments I would give my students is that to tell me the group that you least like to work with. Tell me who that is. The one you feel least comfortable. And very often you hear something like pedophiles, etc. That's the group you need to understand better. Because if you go on what you believe, then you won't be able to help them. Yes, sir. Hopefully that's helpful to you.
Yes, ma'am. I was fortunate enough at my home institution, Salisbury University, to be present for a lecture on this very topic last week, delivered by a colleague of mine who was in our history department there at university. And he made the point that I would share with the folks that are here today that not the label, but how do we identify these individuals who are making this transition from a home country to a new country. How we identify them is a part of that getting down to the brass tacks, the bare details. Asylee, immigrant, refugee. 3 different categories, 3 different sets of circumstances that facilitate that geographic transition. And so in looking at these populations, it was impressed upon me that it's important to understand their actual status. Is this a political, is this someone seeking political asylum? Is this someone that is moving primarily for the sake of economic advancement? Or is this someone who is escaping some sort of maltreatment or other? And so in that getting down to the details, making those distinctions has, I believe, the effect of helping to focus the energies in the way that they can best be utilized to serve the populations.
And thank you so much. Language also has a lot to do with how we feel about people. And so some of those labels become pejorative labels for individuals. thinking about them. But if we really are going to make any headway, we're going to have to go beyond what we call people and ask them the question, what is the personal cost of migration for you? Because there's usually a personal cost. And what's the benefit? Well, we usually don't take that time. We're only looking at it, and we haven't studied as much what success looks like. And if we study success, we can model success and not be so focused on everything has a negative outcome. Because there have been people who've been able to survive under tremendous pressures. One of my colleagues is out there who did research on child soldiers in Sierra Leone and how they were able to become leaders in their community. Well, you would never be able to see them become leaders if you're only focused on the atrocities and not the circumstances that led to the atrocities. Yes.
I would like to express my appreciation of the way you introduced your lecture on your anecdote on the fire, that statement, I have a right, to me was central to the idea of the spirit both liberated from within and the larger society. I was reminded of the quote that for truth to prevail, somebody has to tell it and others have to accept it. So when you see the problems of hierarchization you mentioned, and what Dr. Morris mentioned in terms of how immigration is, or migration is seen in different categories. I was reading a newspaper in Germany where an African said, without begrudging the Syrians, we wish they had the same attitude to Africans, So could you speak to how this idea of spirit has something to be respected both by the individuals and the larger society?
You know, it's amazing how spiritual qualities can transcend some of the things that we think a person cannot overcome. So I don't know that I'm specifically sort of answering your question, but what I find is that it brings a commonality to something that we all can share, that common bond, that there is something greater than ourselves that can pull us together and make a difference in our world. So I think very often when we're able to tap into that, then the person is able to see that the other person has rights that they hadn't thought about. The other thing that I would add to that, I was thinking of a conversation I had with a young person the other day regarding their immigration status and some things they didn't understand about the relationship between African Americans and other immigrants. And what I had them to reflect upon is that you have a right because somebody else sacrificed. The rights that you have in this country are because someone else stood in the gap and they really were victimized. And that is very much a part of the African American community's experience, is that someone died and paid the price for rights of other people. And sometimes the other people don't always know that history. And because they don't know that history, they don't know that there's a commonality of spirituality that transcends all of that. But that part is left out sometimes, that someone paid the ultimate sacrifice for us to proclaim that we have a right. So even though we've opened the doors, we haven't really given all the information that you should have with the open door. And because of that, we get conflict. Because you simply see the open doors and not the sacrifices people have made for those doors to be open, and are feeling sometimes that their rights are being suppressed by the rights of others. So I sort of answered some other kind of things in there, but that's a part of that spiritual, the connectedness, that if we all know that there is something beyond individual faith, there is something beyond your professions, as Dr. Morris said. It doesn't really matter whether you're a political scientist or a social worker. At the end of the day, it's about finding that common good and embracing that common good and being able to realize that common good comes in flawed people. You know, if I only focus on your problems, I will never be able to pull out that common good, because all I see is the atrocity. And I did not see what happened to help to create that. So that's that spiritual piece that you're able to sort of move beyond what you've seen to what you know. It will heal us more than some of the other things that medical science is important, right? But there's also something about the human spirit that transcends that sometimes. Yes, sir.
It's just a brief comment here to say that I really appreciate also the call that you're launching to begin to rethink the whole idea of human rights, you know, to begin to sort of strike some kind of a balance and equilibrium away from the dominant narrative of the negative. You know, because when you look at the discourse on human rights in Africa, it tends to be weighted, as you rightly point out, towards, you know, the abuses, the violations, and not that much on the side of, you know, the possibilities, you know, of something different. And my hope is that, you know, I mean, it's very difficult also, let me point that out, because when you're dealing with these spaces and formations that are just under these very, very heavily totalitarian and authoritarian regimes, just like Dr. Morris was pointing out in the case of Mali, and there are other examples that we can point to, it becomes a real challenge, you know, it becomes a real challenge, not to really also focus on the other side. Yeah. But I think, you know, the call that you're putting forward here is one that could begin to shift the discourse away and create that balance there. And that's one of the positives that I really got from your attempt to redefine, you know, or call us to rethink this whole notion of human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that I'm being signaled to act like a power moderator. You have to go, otherwise
Thank you so
thank
much.
you. And in that same light, we tend sometimes to see it when people receive migrants and when they receive immigrants, as they do in Europe, but we often forget that those migrants, and when they go for economic reasons, are maybe different from those that go as refugees, but those economic reasons are refugees from a disastrous, economically violent situation. Frequently, when there have been moments of openness, the economic refugees, if you take France and Algeria, for example, have been associated with economic development and economic stability. And while it might not be ideal, it is economic stability. So when we see Africans migrating inside of Africa and around Africa, it is also leading to some obvious things like money being sent back home. That is a major source of economic boosting. But it also, we tend to forget that generates not just the money, but by the mobility in Africa that is essential to the future economic development of Europe and of the rest of the world. And with that in mind, our next speaker has a unique focus on development issues as they link to migration. Dr. Michael Mbanaso, I just took a race slip. Mbanaso from social work is an associate professor, but I noted here that he has served as a principal investigator at the African Development Bank project. And I was going to go in, I didn't get a chance to go in with him to discuss some of the other faculty who've been at Howard and have also been linked to it in the past years, because I think it is an important part of our commitment to understanding economic issues in Africa as well. Dr. Mbanaso is also a PhD in urban studies from Portland State University, and he has been an adjunct professor here for, I guess, for the past 3 years. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce our distinguished speaker, Mbanaso.
Thank you and good afternoon. Thank you to Dr. Dr. Winstead and Dr. Cham and the African Studies Department, the organizers this afternoon. So it is a pleasure to be here this afternoon to share with you some of our work in the past several years. It is a difficult subject. It is depressing sometimes, particularly when you're back on the continent. And I hope, as Dr. Cham observed, that we can marry the negative with the positive that Dean Crewe has suggested. As many of you know, Africans have experienced oppressive bonds throughout most of their recent history. And these have assumed both political and economic character. But what happened in the last several years, for those of us in the Washington DC area and in the US, was we noticed the rapidity of migration of Africans to the US. Of course, it's been going on for the past decades, but 80s, 90s saw some sort of uptick in migration of Africans to the US and Europe, of course. Not only that, we also observed that Africans here, the non-immigrant on non-immigrant status, became students, professionals to work, etc., began to adjust their status to that of resident status to naturalized U.S. citizenship. In addition to that, those of them that were migrating also began to seek asylum. So we got involved through some of the attorneys in the area who were doing immigration law at the time. A lot of them were Harvard University graduates, because my office used to be on the West Campus where the law school is, and we used to chat, mingle, a number of them from the Caribbean and Africa. So oftentimes they call us to give expert opinion on country conditions in those African countries, because they need this in order to petition for asylum, etc., etc. So it was alarming. The numbers were alarming. So we began to raise the question, what is going on? Because a number of us have been away for quite some time. So what is happening on the continent? Because for them to get asylum, you have to meet the threshold of human rights abuses. You can't get asylum with poverty, that you're poor, your country can't produce goods and services, and that's why you're here. So we had to look at the human rights situation in Africa to determine what was taking place. Why are there so many Africans seeking asylum here? So that led us to do a conference first to, let me back up here. Also, it was also some self-interest, of course, because when you give these expert opinions, they want to know from you your qualification in order to render such things. So publication, write-ups, etc. So we began to look at it from a scholarly point of view. Before I continue, I'd like to acknowledge my co-author, Chima Korea, who's professor at the Marquette University in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We used to wear this session in the University of Nigeria and Soka on sabbatical. And then, of course, some of our graduate students in the School of Social Work who helped us gather data for this. The data we used came from the U.S. Department of State on human rights reports in Africa, and also the U.S. Department of Homeland Security immigration data by country. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is to share with you some of the highlights and the key points for what we looked at, some of our findings, and engage you in some of the discussion, because we don't have all the answers. I mean, I've looked at the work. I've been on the continent several times. I go back and forth now for the past 3 years doing some work on the continent. I still don't understand it. I still can't explain it. So I'm hoping that some of the issues raised will stimulate some discussions to see if we can begin to address the problems we have. So what I'd like to do is to provide some overview on some of the issues, and then get straight to the country conditions in terms of human rights, and see if we can link human rights abuses to the migration patterns we've witnessed in the last 20, 25 years, particularly in the US. We know also that Europeans are taking their own share of the migrants. And then I think within the past few days, Dr. Winston suggested we talk a little bit about what has been happening in the past few weeks, month or so, about the, in the midst of the Syrian refugee crisis in Europe, the reports also coming out that some Africans there. So where are the Africans coming from? Are these refugees? Are these issues of poverty, etc., etc.? So we wanted to look at first the African migration patterns in the mid-20th century. I started from the 20th century, post-World War II era. I chose that point of departure because of that was also coincided with the decolonization phase of most African countries in the late 50s, 60s. So we looked at migration pattern within those periods. So I'll just provide a quick overview of these elements. Dr. Morris already mentioned about the economic drive to migrate. Within this period, most of the migration was within African countries and cross-border to the neighboring countries. For instance, as the colonizers departed the continent, so we had a lot of push from the land that folks began to move to the cities. Particularly if you use West Africa, for example, they also migrate across the trade routes. Africans like to trade a lot. So you see a lot of them within West Africa. And then also push to the metropolis. So a few factors necessitate this. First, the stagnation we experienced in the agrarian sector. Low productivity, the rural environs were very, very structurally underdeveloped. Nothing was going on. And at the same time, you had some urbanization taking place in some of the few urban centers that existed at the time of decolonization. And of course, industrialization that saw some large-scale industries coming up in this center. Of course, what is being referred to as the growth of third world cities. Now, the key element here is that a lot of the African countries may have one city, what they call primate city, and then the rest of the country will gravitate towards that city because that's the only place that's viable economic activity. So you had a lot of population explosion around the cities with limited opportunities, but they are there. So we have squalor, shacks, and shanty towns growing there. So that was the first phase of the migration we experienced in Africa. So let's go to the next one. And then, of course, the theoretical explanations of that migration pattern. I know Dr. Morris talked about the economic aspect of it. That has been the major focus of the factors affecting migration, the economic aspect of it. So there was the discussion of economic imbalance. The few urban centers were favored for development, unlike the rural environs. Then, of course, the other issues are environment, deforestation, and displacement, forced displacement. Regional conflicts, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, regional conflicts and wars. Then globalization in recent years. This has been the dominant fact of explanation folks have been using, which is based on market forces. Market forces are said to be dominant in this. So we have, not that globalization hasn't been going on for a number of years, but it did intensify within the past 15, 20, 25 years. So you have this ease flow of finance capital across national borders, facilitated by multinational corporations. Then, of course, you have labor mobility. So the argument is that as we see today, why the migrants they get to Hungary, they don't want to stay in Hungary, they want to get to Germany. So the argument is that the regions, so you have hierarchy of production here. So the regions that are highly producing goods and services are attracting both labor from the low producing areas. So when you talk about economic migrants, yes, they're living the structurally underdeveloped regions, looking for the points that are highly producing goods and services. And what that creates is inequality, exploitation, and social injustice that exists. So, however, as we look at the literature, we found out that there isn't much link that is being tied to basic regimes we have in Africa and the human rights. So they seem to gloss over there. So we set out to see how, since the U.S. was granting a lot of asylum and provide residency, what is the role that this may contribute to or help us explain the migration patterns? So if we could go to the next one. So quick overview, post-colonial African regimes and human rights crisis. So we looked at 1960 to 2000, looking at the data where they were available. Africa was seen as a continent under siege following post-colonial era. You may also recall that for when we look at, for those of us who were later then, that it was euphoric period. We understand during the post-colonial period of independence across Africa, Uhuru, etc., etc. However, that was short-lived because Africa engulfed in violent uprisings across the board. You will be hard-pressed to find African country that was not at war, that was not under one military dictatorship or the other, or one party group. So this was what we had over this period of political turmoil, wars, military coups, political assassinations, onset of dictatorship and one party group. That's what across Africa. In West Africa, for example, we've shown that from around 1960 through 2004, 16 West African countries experienced 44 successful military-led coups, but the 3 often bloody failed coups, at least 82 coup plus, 7 civil wars, and many others of political conflict. So the question for us also is, what were the origins of the crisis? Did we just explode because we hated each other or what? So there also have been explanations, I'm sure, students of political history, we have their theory. So the several issues we are raised, the Cold War politics, hegemonic interests, and those that adhere to this view will point to the Congo. What exactly happened after Congo independence with the assassination of Patrice Lumumba at the time. The Western countries were involved. Of course, from what we understand from the archive is that Washington's view was that they didn't want another Castro in Africa. Lumumba had to go. So that seemed to be the turning point of African human rights crisis, I would think. Then the other issue was the colonial rule and the artificial geographical boundaries that we saw across the landscape. And my mention of disparate ethnic groups. Nigeria is a prime example. Just after independence, by 1967, Nigeria descended into civil war with the Biafran Igbos wanting to secede from the country. It was bloody. It was the first ethnic cleansing war we saw in Africa before the recent times of the genocidal war. Then, of course, some political economists have suggested it just made class struggle using the Marxist terms. So, regardless of where we think the crisis may have started, this impacted on every aspect of African life: social, economic, political, development, underdevelopment within Africa, within this period. So, if we go to the next. So, what we did was the data looked at West African sub-regions, Central African sub-regions, East Africa, North Africa, Southern Africa. The tables, the figures. Okay, yes. So, just quick overview. This may not be accurate. Some of these countries may have changed positions. If, for example, if we look at Gambia, the Gambia cannot be here. The Gambia should be here. because the strong man or the big man has been there for a number of years. So we cannot consider the Gambia, I'm sorry, Dr. Chan, as a democratic country. So, you also note that some of these countries, we're going to look at again their human rights records, Nigeria included, is democratic, but we're going to look at the country conditions of human rights. So this was what we had as of, I believe, 2007 in this Canada. So we have a number of democratic, just look at the number of undemocratic countries, partially democratic. Even the democratic countries, you still have restrictions on freedom of speech, freedom of expression, assembly. You cannot criticize the government so much, even though they say they're democratic. This is just a quick overview. We can go to the next one. So, within the mid to the late 20th century, we saw another part of migration. So the first one was within Africa. So this one included a lot of Africans who were going to Europe and North America for higher education. You still have the refugees and asylum seekers. You have those that are already on the continent, in the US, North America or Europe, who were getting back together with their spouse or children and parents. So we saw all of this, refugees, asylum seekers, education, family unification. So if we look at the figures, so what we did was, the graphs. What we did was, so we looked at the different sub-regions of Africa, but our interest was focused on East and West Africa sub-regions. For one or two reasons. The first reason being that you have a lot of West Africans in the US. And they say that out of every 4 Africans, 1 is a Nigerian. When you look around the Washington DC area, another conspicuous group is the Ethiopians. So we chose Nigeria in West Africa, Ethiopia in East Africa, to understand what exactly is taking place. So look at the ones with the graphs. Not this one. Yes. So if you can scroll down to West Africa. So this is Northern Africa. You see that the migration from North Africa is pretty low. But if we move to East Africa, yes, East African countries. So the other way. This is East Africa. So the other one is North Africa. They're in the hundreds. But East African and West Africans are in the tens of thousands. So East African countries. So if you look at, can we see the entire graph? Is it possible? Right there. So you look at the big years, I think it's East Africa, the peak years tend to coincide around the late 90s. So, and they're approaching about 14,000. Even though some countries are missing, if we have other countries, I'm sure they will be higher than this. But this is a snapshot of migration by the country put out by Department of Homeland Security. So if we look at West Africa, which is a little lower, this West Africa, yes. Yeah, it's right there. So you see again the 90s, this is the peak, approaching 25,000. So this is high number when you compare to what US admits of 4 countries around the world at this period. So let's go down to the table. There are some tables down there. So this is not immigrant admission. This US African refugees are people seeking asylum, permanent residents, and naturalized citizens in the US, 1999 to 2008. So we have non-immigrant admission from Africa's region of citizenship, total number of non-immigrants, persons naturalized from Africa's region of birth, total number of persons naturalized, then persons obtaining permanent residency from Africa's region of birth. Here again, some data, we have some missing data. Still, the numbers are high. If you just go up a little, yeah. If you look at 1999, we have right there. So you see, 1999 we had about 36,000. Again, if you move to this and you see that Nigeria is missing, if Nigeria were included there, the numbers would be higher. So just the little data we're able to gather, we had high numbers of those from Africa, 44,000, 53,000. It kept increasing, and then in 2005, instead of decreasing, it kept going. And here we have 2006 years. Here we have 2008, 105,000. Now, the assumption could be that, a lot of African countries are democratizing, so maybe the petition for permanent residency or naturalized citizenship may drop. No, it was not dropping. It kept going high and high and high. So, never to this part. So what we like to do now is, just like hold on a second. So again, what we did was to look at country conditions in terms of human rights in Africa. Again, we split them into sub-regions. West Africa, we chose Mali and Nigeria. Mali is a hotspot at the moment. Nigeria we chose again because of their population size, because of their they claim to have gone back to civilian democracy. So let's see whether the human rights conditions have changed. Again, we choose Ethiopia and Eritrea because, again, the population of Ethiopia is in the Washington DC metropolitan area. To see if any, of course, Ethiopia plays an important role in Africa today. Some people call it the international capital. Addis Ababa is the international capital of Africa. That's why we have AU, that's what they go for, meetings, etc., etc. Then Central Africa, we chose Cameroon. Cameroon, where we have the president for over 30 years now, so we want to see what is taking place there. Now, Congo we chose in Central Africa because for the history. Congo has not had peace since independence, so we also like to see what is going on and see how this explain the current trends. Again, this is to stimulate the discussion, see can we get a handle on what is taking place? We don't have the answers, we don't have the solutions. I personally don't even understand it, can't even explain it. But we're trying to see if we can raise some issues that can stimulate the discussion. So the other, if we can look at the other category, the one with the country report on human rights. This one. So here so this is U.S. Department of State, Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, country reports on human rights practices. Now, this is authoritative data for the U.S. For you to meet the threshold to be considered for asylum, some of this have to be in place. This is what the immigration courts use. This is what the immigration lawyers use. This is what human rights lawyers use. So we went back to look at this. Again, we chose 2014. In our previous work, we looked at those other years, but probably will not help us today to understand the current trend. So we want to understand what is happening. So the last report was 2014. So 2015 is not our year. So what is happening in this area? They are split into sections. You have section 1, you have section 2, you have section 3, you have section 4, and other subsections. So the first one here is respect for the integrity of the person, including freedom from arbitrary unlawful deprivation of life, disappearance, torture, and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, arbitrary arrest or detention, denial of fair public trial. So, going to provide an overview of this is how are we doing with time? We good?
Yeah, I'm gonna check mine, but go ahead.
Okay, great. So, if we look at Mali, Mali and West Africa, also I'd like to point out that Mali is one of the routes that some of these immigrants that have been ended up in Italy and Germany are passing through the desert and maritime routes. Yes. So if we look at arbitrary and unlawful deprivation of life, we see that there were several reports that the government or its agents committed arbitrary or unlawful killings. So a bunch of them. So here, Mali, the AQIM is the Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, operating in Mali. So the affiliates launch frequent attacks, killing civilians as well as national and international security forces. As we'll see later, some of the migrants are affected by forced displacement, they're affected by destabilization, they're affected by so forced displacement and destabilization could be caused by any of these elements. Now, when such activities are in place within a country, the government forces go crazy. They claim it's for security reasons. They do all kinds of things. So Mali has been a case in point recently with some of these extremists operating within the region. Under the next one, the disappearance, I think the position it there. No, no, still in Mali. Oh, yeah. Okay, right there. So we have the second column here is disappearance. The other one is torture and other inhuman or degrading treatment. So here, disappearance, there were several reports of politically motivated disappearances. The government investigated 28 cases and arrested 22 soldiers and generals, including former Captain and Crewe and Sanago, believed responsible for the forced disappearance, torture, and unlawful killing of 21, etc. Torture is fine. Yeah, right there, is fine. So there were reports, in terms of torture, there were reports that soldiers employed torture against individuals with suspected links to the MLA or extremist groups, including NUJO. I put this on purpose without putting what the full name. So in a lot of these countries, you have a lot of security forces that are everywhere. You may have 10, 15, 20 that are dealing with whatever reason, part of it is for repressive tendencies. Prisons conditions were harsh and life-threatening due to overcrowding and to inadequate sanitary conditions and care. Arbitrary arrest or detention, corruption, and judicial inefficiency contributed to a minimum problem of arbitrary arrest. This is interesting. So, this is one of the positive aspects of corruption, believe it or not. So if you're arrested or detained, you can bribe your way out of it. Excuse me. I mean, it's unfortunate. So oftentimes people are arrested for trumped-up charges. But if police officers frequently arbitrarily arrested and release drivers in exchange for bribes, so this could get you free. whether it is something or not, just as long as you have the money, you're free. Denial of fair public trial is another problem. The executive branch continues to exert influence over the judicial system. Corruption and limited resources affected the fairness of trials. Bribery and influence peddling were widespread in the courts, according to domestic human rights groups. If we look at those other countries, a lot of these measures are present, but to different degrees. Let's look at Nigeria, for instance. Nigeria, again, remember that Nigeria now has a democratically elected government. So, what is the country condition in terms of human rights? Let's examine Nigeria, for instance. The government and its agents committed numerous arbitrary and unlawful killings. The National Police, Army, and other security services committed extrajudicial killings and used lethal force to disperse protesters. This is a democratic environment. The disappearance, abductions, and kidnappings of civilians by criminal groups were a common occurrence. Reports suggest that Joint Task Force regularly torture, beat, and abuse demonstrators and detainees. Illegal detentions were reported by NGOs, violent Sharia penal codes exist in some states in Nigeria, particularly in northern parts, with very harsh punishment. Unofficial military prisons were reported to exist. The security force could have their own prison without being sanctioned by the government. So we look at the arbitrary arrest or detention. Department of Security Service committed human rights abuses, particularly in restricting freedom of speech and press. Lengthy pre-trial detention remains a serious problem. Judicial system is highly corrupt and susceptible to pressure from executive and legislative branches and the business sector. Major problem. These are human rights issues. I think let's just go down and look at the next section. Section on respect for civil liberties, including so go down a little bit. Let's see if we can look at that before we wrap up. Right there. Okay. Yeah. So if we look at Mali, respect for civil liberties, and just yeah, right there. That's fine. So, yeah, right there. Right, that's fine. So freedom of speech and press, Mali, violence and harassment, kidnapping, illegal detention, and assaults on journalists occurred during the year. Freedom of peaceful assembly and association. In rare cases where the government deemed protests inappropriate, the government denied approval. Freedom of movement, protection of refugees, in-country movement. While in-country movement was not formally restricted, the army established checkpoints to maintain security, and the unstable security situation limited freedom of movement. Now, Section 3 says respect for political rights, the rights of citizens to change their government. Following the coup in 2012, the transitional government organized a two-round presidential election in July and August 2011, resulting in the election of President Crewe. Under freedom of assembly, peaceful assembly and association, the government occasionally banned gatherings when it concluded their political, ethnic, or religious nature might lead to corruption and lack of transparency. Corruption is endemic in Nigeria. Officials frequently engage in corrupt practices with impunity. Here, this one is interesting. Most countries in Africa, even those that have claimed there's a transition to civilian regimes, administration. Now, think about those under one-party rule, where president has been in power for 30 years, like Biya in Cameroon, Congo, where Kabila wants to find a way to continue his reign. So let's go back to PowerPoint, see if we can summarize that and respond to. So the last, we want to get the internet on that. Unfortunately. That's okay. Let's go to the last slide. So the question becomes, So this, what can be done? I think Dr. Morris raised some points about the economic situations and the attraction to France in the earlier times, and then the issue of how do we combine the negative aspects of human rights to the positive aspect. When citizens have found themselves under undemocratic regimes, they are very vulnerable. Roadblocks, for instance, is something, I guess, let's put in perspective. You're here in DC, you're traveling to Baltimore. There may be 10 checkpoints, 10 roadblocks. So a trip that takes maybe an hour will take you all day to get to, for instance. That's what happens when you see security checkpoint. So citizens are afraid within their own environments. They live in fear. The government's rule with intimidation, harassment, and terrorizing the people, oftentimes with the vigilant groups. So for what we're seeing now in Europe, looked at the data. Two major countries involved are from, the populations are from Nigeria and Eritrea. So one may ask, what is happening in Nigeria? Eritrea, we know that they've had the same ruler since independence in 1993. But what's happening in Nigeria? So when Nigerians could claim displacement, they could claim destabilization in the northern region where the Boko Haram groups are operating, forced displacement where government is not providing services to the refugees displaced within their own country, and of course the poverty issues and human rights. Of course, the UN does not make any provision for economic migrants. They only recognize those that face persecution, something with the United States. So for us to stem the tide, I think we have to begin to look at the country conditions. How do we address the country conditions on the continent as a whole? And then, of course, when you have insecurity in the land, a lot of people, you have to have a stomach to be in such an environment. So you have a lot of banditry, ethnic militias, government forces, human rights, all affect the development sector that Africa is suffering from persistent, structurally underperforming economy. It is bad, it is very bad. But there is hope. Some of us are returning now to do some work on the continent. We are braving it, and then with the partnership from this end, I think something can change. I thank you so very much for the opportunity.
I think we have some time for questions. I don't know what that, 10 minutes?
Yeah.
I have to do with this finger thing. So feel free if there is a question about the visiting professor from Palaver.
Yes, sir. First of all, thank you for your presentation. And just a question and an observation. First of all, why Eritrea? Why is it that such a small, recently developed nation would have such a large number of people trying to leave? And the second thing to mention, and again, this comes about because of my having had the opportunity to experience a session like this back at SU. Immigrant populations, refugee asylum populations also need to change their policies as well. You take a look at Italy, for instance. People come seeking asylum, coming as refugees to Italy, and who is not, to a great extent, doesn't fall under the auspices of the Italian government, but it falls to the Italian airlines, who make determinations as to whether or not an individual is indeed eligible for asylum. And I'm taking this information from the talk I just heard last week. And the airlines then in Italy make that determination, and if someone is understood not to meet those criteria, it's incumbent upon the airline then to pay the airfare to send the person back. And so that has an effect on who it is that is allowed to come into Italy in particular, as opposed to who is not. So, but back to the first one, why Eritrea? Why do you think there's such a large number?
So let me, on the airline issue, I think what happens on the international travel is that you're supposed to screen the documents
Right.
of your passengers.
Right.
So I'm sure Italian airline gets involved because those may have come by air. If those have come through the local routes or through the Mediterranean, I don't think they'll be liable for that. I think if they've come by air, you're liable to pay for their deportation.
Right.
It's applicable across the board, it's not just the Alitalia or Italian airline. Now, Eritrea initially was fighting their independence, I think from Ethiopia, etc. There were border wars. Unfortunately, the global community rallied around them, but shortly after independence, Azega Afwerki, I believe his name, just became a dictator. So if we look at the table, he clamped down on, he restricted any opposition. So under such circumstances, people who could leave left. Eritrea, for instance, for you to travel, you need to go and get permission, exit permission to get with your passport to fly out to go anywhere. So the conditions are deplorable. So Eritreans are leaving, those who could leave. They're not even allowing them to leave, but those who could leave have left. A year or two ago, there were issues. Again, I'd like to mention that the U.S. Department of Human Rights report are mine. When you go to the NGOs or the African Watch, etc., you see the harsher reports on human rights. A few years ago, UN was suggesting, UN High Commission for Refugees was suggesting that do not repatriate anybody back to Eritrea. They get tortured and probably killed. Because Eritrea is claiming, Eritrea is forcibly conscripting young men into the army. And if they can determine that you ran away and you're back, that's it. So the global community came together not to repatriate any refugee back to Eritrea. So Eritrea is bad news. It's a basket case. That is why I believe that folks are leaving the region.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. I think it was an excellent presentation and an excellent overview too about migration, African migration and human rights. I have two observations here. I think one thing was missing the general presentation from the Dean and from you. I think when we talk about migration, citizenship and human rights, something is missing with cultural identity and human rights. Why? Because most of the time, the immigrant or migrant think if they solve a problem of citizenship in the host country, they will have automatically the human rights resolved. No, we see that across the board in Europe, for instance. In France, that is my ex-colonizer, we come from Côte d'Ivoire, you will see that in the national imaginary about the construction of the national identity, they not the cultural identity of this come from Africa. So although they're French citizens, they not accept in the national identity discourse that part of the national identity. Right? So because they're not part of the national identity, you won't see the representation, social representation. For instance, you won't see them on TV, you won't see them on Congress, etc., etc. The second point here, this drives us to another point that is missing here, is one of the factors of migration or immigration to what I call the colonization of the imaginary. You can see some African people who are wealthy, the doctor, medical doctors, the professor, but at one point of their life, because of the construction of the colonized imaginary, the things they need absolutely to go overseas in Europe, because they told them over there, it had been constructed over a century and the years too, they will have a paradise. So I think the point here, when we talk about migration and we cannot miss, is about the relationship between citizenship, that is a relation between obligation and right, cultural identity and human right. And if you don't integrate the cultural identity, you won't see why in the host country, because you talk about, for instance, the vulnerability of the citizenship in the democratic country, right? But in the host country, we can talk about vulnerability of representation of cultural identity of the new citizens that come from Africa. So I think the discussion should move also towards this aspect.
If we are, thank you so much, once well taken. If we had gone back to beyond, excuse me, pre-mid 20th century, we could pick up on those. And the introduction of the book, and the where it talks about the cultural issue. There's no denial. The issue of human rights for a long time seemed to be the preserve of the Western countries. The third world countries, where if you observe what happened in the Cold War, the West turned a blind eye on issues of human rights on the continent. Mobutu was reinforcing unitary government in Angola, and wars was going to, because they claimed they were fighting communism. Mozambique was going through the same thing with South Africa, having a rebel group backed by Washington. So we didn't go back to the 20th, mid-20th century. So there's no denial. We understand that. So for this particular segment, it was not dealing with that. But the introduction of the book talks about the broader aspect. That even for a while, we thought that the Africans were immune to the issue of human rights abuses because we didn't see more activism or revolution against these autocratic regimes. It wasn't until the late 80s and early 90s that the Western countries began to retreat from supporting these despots, that we began to see opening up of NGOs and civil society groups to challenge the dominant forces of the totalitarian regime. So those are there. That's not there. So you are absolutely correct. It is. So that's and those of them that in the Western world, I don't think they're also naive that not everything is extended to them. It's just when you weigh your what economists will call your trade-offs, where you want to be at the time. People go home and they disappear. That's how bad. At least there's some relative, perception of freedom. At least security, basic security is there. You won't be afraid of armed gangs barging into your door at night to rape your daughters and wives, that sort of thing. It is bad, but I understand your point.
Well, I think we need to thank, if there are no more questions, we need to thank Dr. Palaver.
Thank you.
Acknowledge our organizer as well, and if you want, Dr. Winstead, Wheeler Winstead, who is the overseer.
Thank you, Dr. Morris. I am not the overseer, but that's okay. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, presenters, Dr. Morris, Dr. Mbanaso, and Dr. Crewe, who left. Thank you for your comments, everyone. We do want to remind you that this is a series. There are a number of palavers that you will be seeing. Make sure we have your email address, and we will make sure you are aware of that. A quick plug for your book. I meant to do that. The book that Dr. Mbanaso has been talking about is his recent book, this one here, and I'm sure he'd like you all to take a copy home. I was trying to convince him to give everyone who came free, but I couldn't. But he said,
Did you say that?
he said it's almost free. He said it's $25. So, you can take a couple for $50. That's a discount rate. So anyway, please consider getting the book where he does address some of the issues that Dr. Akasi mentioned in a much broader way. What he was referring to, particularly in this presentation, is just one chapter in the book. The book does cover a lot of the more broad aspects of those issues of migration and human rights. So please do that. Thank you again, and please be aware of the Palaver series that are going to be coming up. And I don't know if Dr. Chong or Dr. Hailu have a comment to make. Okay. Thank you very much.